Sucrose deserves much more love and attention. It might seem a little odd to say that about a character who is consistently among the top rated supports in the game, but despite that she so often gets overlooked. She's forever in the shadow of Kazuha and Venti, and for many, she's an afterthought. She should not be so neglected. Despite being a mere 4-star competing with an archon and one of the best characters in the game, she's legitimately just as good as them. In some teams, she's the better choice. She's not without her flaws, and over time, Hoyo have dramatically nerfed the value of crowd control, but for me, she still belongs up there with the other broken early 4-stars who all get far more praise. We meet her in Albedo's story quest, which was one of the first I played through early on in my Genshin journey several years ago. At first glance, I didn't really like her appearance. Not my style of outfit, odd rat tail hairstyle, and even odder ears, but she's such a lovable, must-protect character that I grew to tolerate them pretty quickly. She's socially anxious and awkward, which I find very relatable, and she's endlessly curious about the world. I feel like her and Nahida would get along wonderfully. There's some fun details in her backstory, but one thing which makes her stand out is that unlike seemingly every other anime character, she had a very happy childhood, and her parents are not only loving, but alive. And interestingly, even her vision came to her without any trauma. Her single-minded pursuit of knowledge led to its manifestation during one of her many experiments. One of my favorite moments in time-limited events was during the Windbloom Festival in version 3.5, in which the Sumeru cast made their way to Mondstadt and met several of the people there. Sucrose and Collei were adorable together, and their budding friendship was a memorable highlight. Yet another example why it's really sad that there's no way to play events after their time has gone. Sucrose is an Animal Catalyst user, which makes her very versatile. All of her attacks can cause a swirl reaction, and her charge attacks have no ICD, which helps make her a very effective driver for many teams. Her skill summons a miniature whirlwind just in front of her, providing some crowd control in a small AoE, and damaging any enemies within its circle. It has a painfully long 15-second cooldown, which is one of her biggest flaws. More on that later. Her burst creates a large vortex in front of her, which stays on field, pulsing 3 times, sucking in enemies and causing animal damage with each pulse, before it disappears. Her burst has a 6-second duration and a 20-second cooldown, and a hefty energy cost of 80. If the first pulse comes into contact with a swirlable elemental aura, pyro, hydro, electro, or cryo, the animal construct absorbs the element, and the remaining pulses deal additional damage matching the infused type. The area in which the elemental absorption can occur is much smaller than the damage area, and it doesn't happen until just after the first pulse, but this part of her kit can be valuable if used right. Her first Ascension passive is pretty good. Whenever she swirls an element, she provides a 50 elemental mastery buff to characters on the team who match that element. While this buff does not stack, it's still decent. It has an 8-second duration, works from off-field, and can apply to multiple elements at once. Her fourth Ascension passive is much better. After her skill or burst hits opponents, all party members, excluding Sucrose herself, gain a further EM buff of 20% of Sucrose's EM, again, for 8 seconds. Her first Ascension passive can be a little tricky to max out if you're aiming to buff multiple elements at the same time, but her other passive is both much stronger and much more consistent too. Sucrose is pretty great at T0, though with a big caveat that we'll get to shortly, but gets significantly better via her Constellations. Her C1 provides an extra charge of her skill. In my opinion, this is her most important constellation. Her C2 extends her burst duration by 2 seconds, adding 1 extra instance of crowd control and damage. Her C3 increases her skill's talent level. C4 is pretty great if you use her as an on-field driver. It reduces the cooldown of her skill when you use her normal and charged attacks. Her C5 increases her burst talent level, and finally, her C6 enhances her burst. If it absorbs an element, it provides a 20% elemental damage boost to the entire team for the absorbed element. Before we get to her playstyles, let's talk about her problems. Sucrose's kit has 2 main flaws, her energy requirements and her inconsistency. Plus, there's a big caveat to her at C6, which is worth keeping in mind. Sucrose's burst is highly valuable. It provides off-field crowd control, swirls auras, triggers both of her passives to help provide and maintain her substantial EM buff to the team, and at C6 it can provide an elemental damage boost. It's important to have it available on every rotation. Unfortunately, it has a high cost of 80 energy. This can make Sucrose painful to use if you're unlucky with her weapon and her constellations. This is easy to dismiss if you haven't experienced it. On my main account, I got Sucrose's C1 very early on and had a high refinement sacrificial fragments for her pretty quickly too. Each of those makes a huge difference to her energy generation. Meanwhile, on my alt account, for an entire year, I only had a C0 Sucrose and no sacrificial fragments at all. The difference was shocking. She needed upwards of 230% ER to feel even close to comfortable, a far cry from the 160 or so I had given her on my main. And it forced me to make huge compromises when building her, since that's a high bar to aim for. It's interesting to compare this to Faruzan. I had her at C0 for a year on my main, and her energy problems were nowhere near as bad as my alt account Sucrose, and yet you barely ever hear any mention of Sucrose as being more Constellation locked than Faruzan. I guess it's because Faruzan's cons lock her damage rather than her gameplay, and people are too hyper-focused on the former to realize that the latter is more important. Regardless, if you have a C0 Sucrose and no sacrificial fragments, bear in mind that you'll need to give her a lot of energy recharge to make her comfortable. Once you get her C1 and her weapon, she feels like a completely different character. When it comes to consistency, Sucrose can just feel uncomfortable to use. First, she's one of those characters from early on in Genshin's life cycle who have very awkward targeting mechanics. Both her skill and burst involve her casting magic at a distance, and she can be prone to aiming in unexpected directions if you're not careful. If you're unfamiliar with her quirks, you'll often find yourself targeting an enemy at the edge of a group when really you wanted to hit the one in the middle in order to suck them all in together. The solution to this is to be more conscious of your positioning and timing when using her attacks. Once you get used to it, it does become second nature, and this minor flaw fades more into the background. Second, her burst's elemental absorption is not very reliable. It has a very specific window during its first pulse in which it can absorb an aura, and if you miss that window, it will remain uninfused for the rest of its duration. As mentioned earlier, its absorption radius is smaller than the circle of the burst itself, and since the absorption window is offset from when you actually cast a burst, even if you try to consciously time it, it's tough to get it right all the time. While these are minor issues which can be worked around, they can make her a frustrating character to use while you're getting used to her, but she's absolutely worth the effort. And while at first glance Sucrose's C6 seems pretty powerful and useful, in practice it's not quite that worthwhile, even before taking into account the consistency issues. The problem is that most teams rely on elemental reactions to boost their damage. Sucrose's burst absorbs only one element, and therefore the buff only applies to that element. However, when it pulses, it applies the absorbed element to the enemy nearby, and that can mess with your elemental reactions. For example, say you have a Pyro DPS in a Vapourise team. If you infuse Sucrose's burst with Pyro to gain the 20% elemental damage boost, her burst will then apply extra Pyro, which can remove the Hydro aura from the enemies, stealing reactions and drastically reducing your Pyro DPS character's damage output overall. In these teams, it's generally more preferable for Sucrose to apply the other element. In that example's case, this would be Hydro, since that would mean that enemies would have a more consistent aura for your DPS to react with. You lose out on her C6's buff, but the team is stronger overall. Instead, her C6 only really makes sense in mono-elemental teams. Before we get to her playstyles and teams, let's quickly run through her build. Sucrose's priorities are very clear. She wants enough energy recharge to use her burst consistently, plus as much elemental mastery as possible. Her buff scales off her EM, and most of her damage comes from the swirl reaction. Since swirl is a transformative reaction, the two things that matter for her main source of damage are her EM and her character level, which should be as high as possible. So all the other stats are generally best ignored. The standout weapon for Sucrose is the sacrificial fragments, especially if you have it at high refinement. Its EM is highly valuable, but the true game changer here is its passive, which provides a skill cooldown reset. At high refinement, this is quite consistent, and the extra animal particles it creates are essential for Sucrose to feel truly comfortable without overinvestment into energy recharge. Alternative options for her include the 1000 Floating Dreams, which has a similar damage output to the sacrificial fragments but lacks the extra energy benefits, the Wandering Evenstar, which sacrifices Sucrose's energy in favor of providing an attack buff to the team, or potentially the Favonia's Codex, which provides lots of energy at the cost of having no EM on her weapon. If you lack any of those, she does have some solid free-to-play options. The 3-star Magic Guide has a great EM stat, which makes it pretty strong for her, or alternatively, she could hold the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to help buff one of her teammates. Or if you're desperately in need of extra healing, she could hold the Prototype Amber. As mentioned earlier, for a C0 Sucrose, you'll likely need a lot of ER, but if you've got the right weapon, and at least the first Constellation, she'll be fine with about 160 to 170% or so. If you can reach that through substats alone, then she'll be at her best with an EM Sands, an EM Goblet, and an EM Circlet. Unfortunately, that's a little difficult to achieve, so it's pretty common to replace that EM Sands with an energy recharge one, which will more or less cover her energy needs at the cost of reducing her damage output and the strength of her buff. When it comes to artifact sets, she has one standout option, 4-piece Viridescent Venera. It shreds the enemy's resistance to any elements which are swirled, while also increasing her personal damage output. However, elemental mastery artifacts are frustratingly rare, and there are several characters who may be competing to use them. While you're working on getting a full 4-piece set for her, mixed 2-piece elemental mastery or energy recharge sets are the next best option. Technically, she could also use certain other sets in niche situations. For example, 4-piece Paradise Lost when used as the driver in a Hyperbloom team, but personally I just go for VV or use mixed 2-piece sets. As for her talent levels, Sucrose is one of those rare characters who are perfectly functional even if left with all 3 talents at level 1. Her talent levels only affect her raw damage, which is rarely important, even in teams aimed at improving her damage output. Most of it comes from the swirl reactions rather than her own raw damage. If you want to save the Mora and materials, you won't miss out on much by ignoring them completely. Personally, I leveled them a fair bit just for the sake of completion and a minor damage boost. Sucrose has 2 main playstyles, off-field support and on-field driver. She's most often used as an off-field support. Her buffs and resistance shred she provides can make a huge difference to the damage output of any team which can make use of them, and her crowd control is very welcome. She doesn't require a ton of field time, since she just needs to cast her skill and burst and potentially an extra skill cast to generate some energy particles before she makes way for the rest of the team. VV unfortunately does not work from off-field, so this does slightly front-load the damage in teams with longer rotations, but it's rarely worth paying attention to that level of detail. This role is highly sought after in many teams, and Sucrose is highly flexible and works across a ton of archetypes as a result. Alternatively, she can work really well as an on-field driver for off-field DPS characters. Since all of her attacks can swirl, she can provide a decent amount of personal damage via reactions while she's on field, and she can chain many reactions to provide a large number of smaller instances of damage, especially when fighting groups of enemies. Her effectiveness in this kind of role does go down a little when up against single target situations, but even there, her teams can be surprisingly strong, especially since her fast attack animations can help trigger more coordinated attacks from characters like Xingqiu or Yelan. So which teams is Sucrose worth using in? She's a good fit as an off-field support in Vapourise teams, though getting the most out of her here is tricky. Her EM buff is valuable, since that's generally the stat which gets left behind in most DPS characters' builds, but you do need to be conscious of which element she's swirling. It's key that she swirls the same element that the reaction trigger will be applying. And it's even more important to be careful with her burst, since you likely want to infuse the other element so it doesn't interfere with reactions. Since most of her EM buff applied to the entire team, she is still worthwhile even in teams which make it hard to swirl the right elements, but it's a little more complicated than it might seem at first glance. She had similar pros and cons when it comes to melt teams, though here there's the added problem that most of the characters involved are pretty energy hungry, and she also has some extra competition. For example, she's surprisingly good in this team with Risley as the main DPS and the Zhangling and Bennett duo providing the pyro, but she's also competing with Nahida. Nahida provides a similar EM buff, solid off-field damage, and is fantastic at extending the pyro aura to enable Risley's melt reactions. Sucrose could potentially result in a stronger team overall if you can manage to swirl cryo, but that can be difficult to manage, and most of the time I prefer Nahida here instead. However, if you don't have Nahida or someone like Shenhe available, Sucrose can be a fantastic option for making these teams more powerful. She's actually much more comfortable in freeze teams. While her EM buffs are wasted here, she's still a solid option, more due to the value of 4-piece VV than for anything she brings on her own aside from crowd control. Freeze reactions consistently leave enemies with a cryo aura, so in freeze teams with a cryo DPS, Sucrose's C6 buff is very dependable, and her absorption also helps keep the enemies frozen. However, she pales in comparison to Kazuha in these teams, since his elemental damage buff is much more powerful than hers. And similarly, when it comes to mono-elemental teams such as Mono Pyro or Mono Hydro, Sucrose is a decent option who is overshadowed by Kazuha. Just like with freeze teams, her EM buffs don't make a difference here, and for the most part, she's just there to shred resistance with VV, though it's worth emphasizing that VV is key to making these teams work. Her C6 is very valuable here though, and goes a long way to narrowing the gap between her and Kazuha in these teams. Essentially, she's a decent option for all of these teams which use her as an off-field VV applier, and she will elevate the team's damage. It's only in comparison to Kazuha that her flaws become more obvious. Taser teams are some of my favorites when I want to play Sucrose as a driver. These involve off-field hydro and electro appliers, and there are a ton of options there, with Sucrose taking the center stage. Since the electrocharge reaction leaves an aura which combines both hydro and electro, Sucrose will consistently swell both hydro and electro with every attack, triggering even more electrocharge reactions, resulting in a ton of smaller instances of damage which really add up over time. This team archetype is particularly effective against larger groups of enemies, but can still work in single target situations too. Sucrose is unparalleled in these teams since she can swirl with every attack, and she's far ahead of the other animo options, Hoyo accepted, as a result. Sucrose can also work off-field in Taser teams, so if you prefer to have a different character on-field, then she's still a great option. Soup teams are very similar to Taser teams and can be just as fun. Instead of bringing only Pyro and Electro teammates, these teams include any 3 characters who provide swirlable elements from off-field. The soup of reactions that follows just destroys enemies, especially in groups. One particularly famous soup team is called Sucrose, Sucrose, Kokomi, Fischl, and Xiangling, which can provide some fantastic damage numbers when executed perfectly. The key to Sucrose is that if Sucrose hits Xiangling's Guoba with her skill while he has his exclamation mark above his head, she will swirl Pyro directly from him. This is a huge advantage if you get it right, since it means you can consistently swirl Pyro without needing the enemies to have the Pyro aura, allowing for chain reactions to occur which would have otherwise been impossible. This is pretty difficult to execute consistently, however, so it's rarely used with that level of precision. Even without that extra boost, soup teams are a ton of fun. While Dendro and Anemo do not react with one another directly, Sucrose is actually fantastic in many Dendro-focused teams. These teams are the one place where she shines much more than Kazuha. She's highly valuable in Aggravate teams, for example. Her EM buff makes a huge difference to the team's damage, VV Shred boosts Electro specifically, and since she consistently swirls Electro in this setup, she also triggers Aggravate reactions herself. Interestingly, in these teams she works great both off-field and as the on-field driver, so there are a lot of team options available. But one place where she really shines is Hyperbloom teams. 2 of the most popular Electro off-fielders are Fischl and Beidou, and both of them have a fatal flaw in Hyperbloom. Their coordinated attacks rarely hit Bloom cores, so they can't drive this reaction consistently. However, they do apply a lot of Electro, which is where Sucrose comes in. Sucrose is able to consistently swirl the Electro from the enemies onto the Bloom cores, and since her build is EM focused already, she tends to do a ton of damage in this team setup. And since she buffs everyone's EM, the Electro sub DPS will do pretty great Aggravate damage as well. The reason she's overlooked for her original role as an off-field support is that Kazuha exists, and to a lesser extent Venti as well. And as a driver, she also has to compete with Hoyo, though there's a little less overlap there. Kazuha provides most of the same benefits as Sucrose, but avoids some of her more frustrating quirks. If Kazuha is C0 or C1, Sucrose still provides more value than him in teams which benefit from her EM buff, but he's C2 at a team-wide 200 EM boost to his burst, which means he covers all the bases at that point. Her C6 would arguably close that gap a little, but its inconsistency means that a C2 Kazuha generally gives better results in most teams, unsurprisingly. Venti has a slightly different take on the same role. His crowd control is significantly more potent, and his personal buffs lean towards boosting the team's energy recharge rather than their EM. As a result, he tends to be a little less useful than Sucrose in most teams, especially in the days since Hoyo started focusing on heavier enemies who are resistant to crowd control. Despite Kazuha's benefits, even after I got him, Sucrose remained my comfort go-to for crowd control and VV Shred for a long time, and to this day I still prefer her in teams which benefit more from an EM buff than an elemental damage bonus. And since the release of Dendro, she finally has some teams where she's head and shoulders above the rest. Sucrose does have her flaws, but her strengths more than make up for them. In some ways, she feels a little bit left behind, especially since she's sometimes viewed as a crowd control provider first and foremost, and over time Hoyo have made sure to release heavier and heavier enemies with more interruption resistance. But despite that, she still has her place, and she absolutely deserves more love than she gets. Until next time!